It was a long journey to get to July 1964. Black America paid a price to get the Civil Rights Bill. It was the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 that set the stage for the Voting Rights Act. It was the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 that set the stage for the Fair Housing Act. And I would say that the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 set the stage for the continuation of our struggle in America for freedom, justice, and equality. And I think sometimes we take anniversaries or moments in history and we extract them out of the historical context. So when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 in the presence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders, that was a historic moment. But a historic moment that accentuated all of the suffering and all of the price and all the sacrifices that led up to that moment.
America was founded, yes, as the democratic experiment, but it was founded on stolen land with stolen labor. So if that is the foundation of your country, then the folks who built it are going to be focused always on their own power. How they keep it, how they hoard it, how they maintain it at all costs, and how they make sure nobody else has any access to power of their own. Because if those folks get access to power, then they're gonna overthrow you. So we find ourselves in these continued moments where people who have been pushed out to the margins by the powerful few, when those folks find a little power and we make a little progress, the intent then always by the powerful is to make sure that we don't get too big for our britches. That we don't ever get too far down the road toward our own freedom, because that spells jeopardy for them and their power. And so there's always a backlash whenever marginalized people, Black folks in particular, make progress in this country. So we see the end of the Civil War, we see emancipation. So after emancipation, we have a period of Reconstruction that's supposed to knit the country back together by, in part, making sure that formerly enslaved people have rights similar to those of American citizens. So then Jim Crow comes along and says, oh, y'all got some Negroes in Congress. We're not doing that, right? So let's go ahead and make sure that not only can you never run for Congress, but that the people who would have put you in Congress can't vote for you. And then we're going to ensure that there's a system of racial terror. So that system of racial terror was there to tell us to stay in our place. Don't bother trying to vote. Don't bother trying to own your own business. That even though enslavement is over, you are still to be a second-class citizen. Fast forward to the Civil Rights Movement.
I had one sister, Yolanda, who passed away suddenly in 2007. And of course, my brother Dexter passed away this year. And it's me and Martin III that still remain. Well, I was so young, so I would be sharing a perspective from what I've heard from my siblings. And they often share about how my sister in particular, their daddy was her buddy. He was fun to be with. I can recall that when he would come home, it was like he was glad to see me, and I would always run up into his arms. And so we were kind of his refuge, around the house. A lot of time at the dinner table. We were just kind of like his place of comfort and joy and probably rejuvenation. And my mother would share that she knew this was important for him to be able to relax and let down because of all the responsibility he had, but more importantly, because of the numerous threats that he had on his life. There was a day in May 2nd, I believe, 1963, called D-Day, where students became a part of the movement in Birmingham, and they marched to the park. And in that park, Bull Connor, who was the public safety commissioner, had his police forces and also the fire department there with water hoses and billy clubs and dogs, and they unleashed them on those kids. And it spread across the country because the media was there. Shortly after the May 2nd, in June, Medgar Evers was killed. And then President Kennedy called for the civil rights legislation.
Medgar Evers deeply admired Dr. King, who was 4 years his junior, but who had preceded him in activism during the Montgomery bus boycott, which is where Dr. King became a known person and a known civil rights leader. Medgar Evers thought that the Montgomery bus boycott was it. Like, he really admired that and wanted to duplicate that exact same kind of activism in Mississippi. What Medgar Evers was demanding from the Kennedy administration and from the country was what he called first-class citizenship. What he believed that he had earned as somebody who fought in World War II. He came home and he and his brother went to try to vote in their small town in Mississippi and were denied. First, when they got there to try to register, about 100 white men met them with guns at the voter registrar's office, and they had to get inside with the help of the registrar who snuck them in around a side door and allowed them to register, but really under the threat of gunmen outside. But when it came time to actually vote, that number had doubled to something like 200 armed men, and it was 4 U.S. Army veterans, Charles Evers, Medgar Evers, and 2 of their friends who also had served in the Army, were denied the right to vote. And I think that those experiences and the experiences of being a young black man in Mississippi and witnessing a lynching when he was only around 11 years old, just none of it were acceptable to him. And so, especially after he had served his country, there was no way that he was going to go in for being told he could vote. What Medgar was doing was providing the same kind of local leadership in Mississippi that King had provided in Alabama. So Medgar and Merle Evers met at Alcorn College. She was a 17-year-old freshman. He was a 25-year-old World War II veteran and football player. They met, fell madly in love. She thought they could just live a perfect kind of 1950s housewife life. But instead, she wound up as the wife of a civil rights leader. When I look at that photo of President Kennedy welcoming what remained of the Evers family, Merle, 2 of her children, because the baby van was too little to travel, as well as her brother-in-law, Charles, and they stood in that White House, a grieving woman who felt a great sense of pride that her husband's most formidable demand, that President Kennedy focus on something other than the tax cut that he wanted to do, and had actually gone on television on the night of June 11, 1963.
Good evening, my fellow citizens.
To make a solid promise that he would advance a Civil Rights Act to Congress, that it would be delivered.
It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. But this is not the case. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
And when Medgar Evers was assassinated, that is part of why there was a March on Washington, because that promise had gone unfulfilled all summer. And so civil rights leaders, including Dr. King, said we need to put a fire under the Kennedy administration.
Every organization that was a part of planning the March on Washington were working in their own spaces. But the big 6 were SCLC, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, Urban League, and then Roy Wilkins Group. And you expanded to include the National Council of Negro Women, which is Dorothy Height. And she's often left out of the equation, but she was a part of that big 6.
Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice.
Well, he had an incredible gift of being able to paint a picture for people to understand what was happening in reality in terms of the conditions and circumstances in the life of blacks in America.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
He talked about police brutality.
We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
And so I look at it as a preacher who's stating a case before this country. This is what's going on right now in this nation. And if this nation is going to be true to who it said it's going to be on paper, then you've got to address this dark area. The triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism were still very present, ever present today. People were at a place where they were fed up with the injustice and wanted to be treated with dignity, respect, and have equity. But he went away from his paper near the end of his speech and climaxed with this "I have a dream" phrase. And he went on to say, you know, in spite of these conditions, I still have hope. I have a dream.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Because that's what preachers do. You know, they start out sometimes with some of the challenges, the issues. A good preacher, at least. A good preacher will have some kind of hope at the end to elevate you. And that's what he did in I Have a Dream.
Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
And then you had the assassination of President Kennedy. By the summer of '64 is when we move into the passage of the Civil Rights Act and then the signing into law by President Johnson, who had taken office because he was the vice president at the time.
LBJ was a traitor to white supremacy, and he wasn't supposed to be. This is a white man from Texas. He was supposed to be a Dixiecrat, a Democrat in name, but a conservative in practice.
Johnson said, he admitted to one of his aides that the Democratic Party, because of Johnson's support and its support of civil rights, probably had lost the South. And he was pretty much correct.
The year after the Voting Rights Act passed, Lyndon Johnson got the highest number of black voters that year. That was also the last time that the Democratic Party won a majority of white votes.